Welcome to Canon Fodder, episode 4, with my guest, Mr. John Slaughter. Today's book, Company K by William March. I actually discovered this book reading, one of those retrospectives on the First World War, a book called The Last of the Doughboys, where this man went around interviewing the last living World War I veterans. And Company K was the most popular book in America at one point. Now you have to go to either, antiquated bookstores or these big box bookstores that just have all these books that no one ever reads. And to me, it's the All Quiet on the Western Front for the United States. And my guest today, Mr. John Slaughter, he actually had a thread on March, and that's how we got to talking about him and getting this episode together. So, John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, man. I'm glad to be here, and I'm excited to cover this book because, as you said, it's criminally unknown, I would say.
So, your thread on Twitter, you brought up to our friend Chris Sandbach, who is probably the Southern literature guy of this thing of ours, let's say. And you said, why isn't William March more well known? And he was kind of flippant about it. He said he's like dollar store William Faulkner or something like that. I haven't read much of March's other works, but this is definitely a book that Faulkner couldn't write. And I'm curious to get your take on this because it does seem like you were disappointed by Sandbach's dismissal.
Yeah, I was. I mean, mainly because I wanted a more in-depth answer because, ironically, the reason that I even stumbled upon William March in the first place was because I'm a big fan of Southern literature as well, and I noticed, like, outside of what's her name that wrote To Kill a Mockingbird?
Harper Lee.
Outside of Harper Lee, there's not, and like Capote, there's not a lot of people from Alabama, writers from Alabama that people know. And I stumbled upon March doing that research, and so I wanted to know. I was reaching out to Sandbach because I wanted to know why March was not well known in comparison to Faulkner, considering the book that that Sandbach is comparing him to is Through the Looking Glass, which March wrote, which is similar to some of Faulkner's writings about Mississippi. So that was, why I had kind of thrown that out there. And I was a little disappointed because it didn't get a thorough answer because I feel like they're very comparable. But like you said, the thing that sets March apart, in my opinion, is Faulkner could not write this book because Faulkner didn't experience World War One, and he definitely, and nobody else as a writer, even like Hemingway, didn't experience combat in the way that March did.
So, and I try not to put the author's biography in the episodes too much because there's a bunch of podcasts that do a way better job of that than I ever could. But I think it's, like you say, it's important to talk about March's relationship to the First World War if we really want to understand this book. William March was a Marine, right? And I believe he fought in every major engagement that the AEF was in World War One.
Yeah, that's right. Because he was with Second Battalion, Fifth Marines, and they were there. They were pretty much first combat troops on the ground, and they fought in every major campaign the Americans fought in. So he was at places like Bella Wood. He was at St. Michael. He was he was near Verdun at one point. Not the Battle of Verdun, but another battle that took place there. So he saw all the combat that the Marine Corps saw during that war.
Right, and Battle of Bella Wood, that's probably the famous battle that Americans kind of point to as their contribution to the war, right?
Yeah, and I mean, because I was in the Marine Corps for 6 years, and that's one of the things they make us memorize is Bella Wood, because it was such an important battle for not only the Americans but the Marine Corps lore, so to speak.
So getting to Company K, William March writes uh, a pretty short book. Actually, it's 100, almost less than 200 pages. The edition that I have is 183, and it's broken up into these small vignettes of every man in Company K. So you get the perspectives of, well, not every man, but at the beginning, each page, like a chapter, is marked by one man in the company. So the first page is Private Joseph Delaney's, and they're all going over their experience in the war or just a small piece of it. So, like, the first short story, like I said, Joe Delaney, he's the stand-in for William March in this case. He's going to write a book about Company K. Thing I think, and I'm going to probably read from it a little bit because it's Delaney rather talking to his wife, and she's talking about how there are some things that are just too horrible to put in the book. Uh, let me just find it real quick. All right. Well, I'll read this part because it's probably one of my favorites in the whole book, and I think it does capstone March's thoughts on the First World War. I repeated my thoughts to my wife, but she said it was not difficult to understand about battlefields. The blood of the men killed on the field and the bodies buried there fertilize the ground and stimulate the growth of vegetation. That was all quite natural, she said. But I could not agree with this too simple explanation. To me, it has always seemed that God is so sickened with men and their unending cruelty to each other that he covers the place where they have been as quickly as possible. And that's the end of the first little vignette. And throughout the book, and I don't know, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, John. But throughout the book, it does he talks about war as this massive tragedy, but also not in the same way that a Dalton Trumbo would write it. He, there's legitimacy there, where I think, especially, I think whenever you think about hesitancy to go to war or just like anti-war demonstration, you think about hippies, you think about people who have not experienced war and they think that there's some sort of expert on it. Maybe I'm not being clear enough, but you were a Marine, so I'm sure that you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's also, there's an early story in one of those little vignettes where he talks. One of the privates is repeating essentially the propagandistic material that they're given about how they're going to fight this war and it's going to be the war to end all wars and it'll bring peace to the world and they're going to defeat these evil Germans, right? And so I think you see that beginning stage of like not hesitancy but the eagerness to go to war. And by the end of the book, as you go through all these stories, right, you see that goes away, right?
Mm.
So you lose, like, there is an element where he kind of shows you in the beginning that, which I'm assuming is a stand-in for himself to some capacity because he wasn't drafted, right? March isn't drafted. He joins the Marine Corps willingly to go fight.
Right.
So there's an element of him, and which I'm thinking that's sort of his, maybe a glimpse into his mentality going into it ready to fight, right? And then by the end of the war, it becomes a pointless thing to him, right? It's just pointless killing to an extent. And I think that probably to a degree maybe answers your question, which there's also this kind of parallels to Junger's point he makes, I think, in Storm of Steel, where he talks about how to have the balance, you need these young, eager men that are ready to go die, but you also need the sort of the battle hardened sergeants and higher enlisted guys who've seen that to kind of temper them as well.
Right. And it's also like, I've read a lot about Frederick the Great and this army that he inherited. It was the greatest army in Europe at the time. And his father didn't he was so enamored with this fantastic army that he had that he never used it because he didn't want to lose it. But at the same time, armies are there to be, there's no point in having the shining armor if it doesn't get tested. There's no point of having this great navy stay in port all the time. And there's definitely got to be a balance there. And we could go into civilian control of the military and the idea around that being, well, less wars will happen because there won't be these bloodthirsty generals getting us into every fight. But now it's these bloodthirsty civilians with no skin in the game that are sending the armed forces around the world.
Yeah, because from their perspective, war is almost, it's an abstract, right? Because one, they've never experienced it, and two, they're not going to have to, at least in theory.
It's not something for them. There's a certain
Right.
there's a warrior caste that they keep hermetically sealed unless completely necessary. But that's not this book. This book
No.
is we see young men volunteering. I think in the second chapter you have a guy who is later killed in the book from another person's perspective, but in his perspective, he's talking about how he can take on the whole German army himself, sort of thing. Uh, he believes himself invincible, and then he's actually uh, he gets killed actually by his own officer later in the book because the officer tells a sergeant to go create an observation post ahead of the line. The sergeant says, "Sir, I don't know about that. The Germans have that pretty pinned down. As soon as we get out there, they're just gonna their artillery is zeroed in on that spot, and we're just gonna get killed." Officer says, uh, you know, basically do what I say, or go kick rocks. And the sergeant goes. He takes 4 men, and they all die.
Right.
And
Yeah, because that ends with the lieutenant. What he's crying out that he didn't know, he
yep,
didn't
yep, he
mean
didn't
to.
he didn't mean to. It's not his fault, and I think, and that's actually an interesting point that we can go down. I was in the army, right? I was enlisted as you said you were enlisted too, correct?
Yeah.
Right. So enlisted guys and officers obviously don't mix. And what I actually haven't met as many officers to get a feel for what they think of their enlisted. I can't imagine that they think we're kind of boorish and unrefined, which probably true. Uh, and we think that they're retarded. I think that's even good officers. There's definitely the butter bar, right? Lieutenant.
Right.
He's so fresh and so new, but he has so much authority that
Well, yeah,
it's
he
almost
doesn't.
paradoxical right there.
Right. Well, he doesn't have the experience, and he has the schooling, right? And I think, not to jump off on a tangent too much about this, but you see that element here where he's telling them to do something that by the book probably makes perfectly logical sense, right?
Right.
But the sergeant, which we're assuming has more experience than him and understands this, is telling him that that doesn't work. And one thing I didn't see in the book at all really is you don't really ever see any perspective from higher enlisted. There's no like first sergeant, sergeant majors,
There's a first
gunnies.
sergeant.
Well,
There's uh I had it right here. He's just very early on. Page 16, First Sergeant
Oh,
Boss.
is that the one where he's talking about like how inexperienced or fresh they
Yeah.
are?
He's
Yeah.
like he's very grizzled and
Right. Well, and that's what I was going to say is like that position of that higher enlisted guy's job is to sort of provide that experience with a little more authority because he's been around long enough. So you pair them with that young officer to kind of temper them, and I didn't see that here. Right? There's no hardened first sergeant standing next to the lieutenant saying, "Hey, that's a stupid idea. Don't do that." You just have this sergeant who can somewhat voice his opinion, but like you said, enlisted guys are basically just told what to do, so he just goes and does it, even though he thinks the lieutenant's retarded.
right. And I think that's also maybe we can say that an innovation of the Second World War is the uh, you know battles
Like,
are fought at company level, let's say, and maybe in Vietnam at platoon level. So more authority is given to the non-commissioned officer class.
yeah, you
Whereas in World
see
War
in
One,
the that evolution of
it's
small unit leadership.
yes, that's the term that was escaping me.
Yeah, I think that's what that's a good point because I didn't consider the fact that that probably hadn't evolved to the point that it is today. Because the officers of the First World War still kind of carry a little bit of that Napoleonic authority from like the Napoleonic Wars, right?
Right. You could almost picture, a grand marshal sitting in a balloon, trying to see why one army isn't running out of the trench while the other is far ahead. Uh, Actually, we were before we went on the air, we were talking about the made-for-TV film, The Lost Battalion, which we both enjoyed, and how an entire battalion of soldiers is surrounded because they don't get the order to retreat in time.
Yeah,
And
that they find themselves, completely trapped behind German lines, way ahead of the American advance.
so in the book, sorry, and kind of a feature more than a bug of my style of talking is the tangents. So for the listeners out there, I do apologize, but that's probably where the most meat of the content comes. But in the book, we start with uh, they kind of go through not basic training, but they're mustered up together. They get some liberty and they're shipped off to Europe. They do a little bit more training and they get their first taste of combat. And we have to remember also that I mean the Americans they're only in the war for about a year, maybe a year and some change. But the French, the British, the Germans, the Russians, they've been at it for 3-4 years at this point.
Right. Yeah, and you
But
see that when they show up in France and they're eager, right? They get off the ships and they're eager and excited and ready to fight, and they encounter the old woman or they encounter the crowd of French that are all dressed in black, and they can't
mhm,
figure out why they're essentially, they're in mourning, and an English speaking woman, basically yells to them that, "Don't you know there's a war going on here?" And it kind of hits them a little bit at that point that like, okay, maybe there's something else going on here because they're just eager to fight. They have no concept of what's about to happen. And outside of the book, and in anybody who knows anything about World War One history kind of knows that one of the reasons the U.S. takes such massive casualties in this conflict is because when they show up, they don't take any of the lessons the Germans and French have already learned, right? They just go into fighting the way that basically the French and Germans fought at the beginning of the war.
I think yeah, and I think that I mean they talk about American innovation, Like for the longest time, the British were trying to figure out how to destroy barbed wire to get into the enemy trenches. The Americans just put down plywood and walk over it.
Yeah.
And obviously, the Germans are upset at the American war crime known as the trench gun.
The shotgun, yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely like, and the book shows the growing pains of the American Expeditionary Force, but the Americans learn how to be cruel very quickly. There's none of this old world. You get the sense that the Americans won't be having a Christmas truce. And I mean, the Christmas truce, that was all the way back in 1914, so there probably wouldn't be one regardless. But it's not even thought of. You have the Captain Matlock in the book. He captures some prisoners and he tells his men to execute them.
Yeah, that's probably. I mean, I do want to get to that. I think though that is one of the more important stories that comes out of the book. But I was going to say that there is a story. There is almost a Christmas truce moment, because if you remember, there's a point late in the novel where there's a lake that they're on one side of and the Germans are on the other, and they actually have a truce throughout, like during the day. Like they can swim at certain times, and they let the Germans swim at certain times. And that story ends with whichever private it is, sort of in his, sort of internal monologue, he's saying, if this war was left up to just the privates and the corporals, this war would have been over a long time ago.
Yes,
So,
and
so
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so you do see, I think, what you see there is you have this evolution of, in the beginning they're extremely eager, and then in the middle they become very cruel and sadistic. But then I think as that same cruelty is sort of received upon themselves, even there towards the end, they realize like they don't even want to do this anymore. So I think you kind of see that with some of them. But then again, the book is sort of designed to give you perspectives from across the company. So, it's kind of hard to tell where, there's not really an overarching, I would say, a concept of how war works, except for maybe the cruelty of it. Because in some of these people are extremely cruel and violent and bloodthirsty, right? You remember the story where they killed a little German boy, but then some of them are extremely, some of these guys aren't like that,
Right. There's
So,
there's one there's one story. A man believes that Jesus Christ has actually come to him in the trenches
mhm.
and asks him to repent. So you get every archetype, let's say, of America in this word or in this book. There's one um, kind of ironic joke played at the beginning, and then kind of fulfilled at the end. There's a German a U.S. soldier of German descent, and he's talking with his buddies, and one of the guys that he's talking with says, "I hear that the Germans, in order to they get the propaganda, right? So like they have to kill children, they hate their mothers, stuff like that." And the German guy says, "That's not true. Germans are just like anybody else, and they love their mothers, and this, whatever." But the guy talking doesn't realize really that this guy that he's serving with, his buddy, is German. And later, when that same fellow is killed, that same guy who was cursing Germany before, he's just like, "Told you, you can't trust those Germans. They kill good American like Dutch here, and these savage animals just can't be trusted." So I don't know. I think March, that's a bit too cruel in my estimation for the book. Um, there's a lot of stuff like that in this book, and he packs it full because it is, like I said, a very short book. I don't know, what is your favorite part of the book, John?
Well, before I tell you that, I will say I think to your point about the book being packed full, the way that I kind of framed it, and I was thinking about this earlier, is I think people have to remember that if they've never read this book, you kind of have to keep in perspective that there is, prior to this book, there really is no American war novel outside of Red Badge of Courage, right?
Mm,
And Red Badge of Courage is not written by a veteran. It's written, so the person writing it doesn't have that first person perspective. With March, you're getting that first taste of like what could be called an anti-war novel, but it's written with somebody with that experience. And if you compare it to, say, something like All Quiet on the Western Front or Storm of Steel or like For Whom the Bell Tolls, right? I think the reason this book feels so packed is because instead of feeling like a narrative, it feels like a series of memories, which, you were in the military, or really anybody who's done anything in their life and they've gotten far enough past it, that event or that series of events becomes just a series of small memories, right? Everything kind of blends together. And I
and I
think
think,
well, I
oh,
was saying, I think
sorry.
that's why this book feels so tightly packed, because it's almost like you're reading through the most impactful memories of each individual person, and so it's like a gut punch over and over again, right?
Definitely. And at the end of the book, the very last story sees one of the men from the company go back to his old base, and who happens to be there but one of his buddies from the war, who's still in the army. And they go through the barracks, and the barracks is condemned at this point. Since, you know after the war, the army slims down quite a bit. Most of the men are released back into civilian life, and all these buildings that were for this huge army that they recruited, they're just gonna let it sit there and rot. And they go through the names of all these people, and you see the main character, or the character from his perspective, his name is not Fairbrother, but his name is Ziegler, right? He's walking around, and he's showing his wife and kids the base that he was on, and he can't remember some of the men. His buddy, whose name is Pig Iron, or his nickname is Pig Iron. He's talking about all these guys. Uh, do you remember so and so? Do you remember this guy? I remember so and so. I remember this other dude. Was he the one that lost his arm? No, no. I think he was the one that got caught with the French girl. Something like that. Um, so these are memories, and these are figments in a lot of ways. There's nothing tangible there, and the men who died, all that's really left of them are really one or two anecdotes that are either poorly told or half remembered or even attributed to someone else entirely.
Yeah, because even a lot of these stories, right? They You don't realize that the narrator, right, is dead until like the last line of that little snippet, which I think is an interesting decision by March, where you'll either read a perspective from somebody, and in the next story they die, or the
Right.
next vignette they die, or right
They're
at the end
already
of that,
dead. Yeah.
yeah, they die within um the last little segment of that. Yeah.
So when we talked about this, we were going back and forth, and I said, pick out a handful,
Mhm.
and we'll just talk about your favorite. And you picked the unknown soldier, which I think that one does uh, illustrate the themes that March is trying to get across here. So why don't you introduce it?
Yeah, so the unknown soldier, it's one of the longer stories that are featured in there. I think it's about four, almost 5 pages, and it occurs towards the end of the novel, and I don't remember the private's name, but they're crossing sort of no man's land, and they get opened up on by a German machine gun. And this Marine falls on his back, and he knows he's been wounded, but he doesn't know how bad he's been wounded. He thinks it's not that big a deal, and then he looks down at his torso, and he realizes his intestines are strung out all over the place, right? And that's when the pain starts to hit him, and he starts to realize like how bad he's hurt. And the rest of his squad kind of makes it back to American lines, and he's just left in no man's land there to die essentially. And as he's doing that, he's having these first he has this memory basically of hearing other men die in no man's land and scream and cry all night. And he makes a commentary that he had always told himself that he would never make noises like that, but the pain got so bad he couldn't help himself. So he just starts intermittently crying out in pain. And in between this, he's also having flashbacks to his youth, and it's not specified, but at some point when he was a kid, he witnessed the government bring home the bodies of American soldiers from some other conflict, and they bury them. And when they do, the mayor of the town gives this big speech about how they fought for these grand causes and they're heroes and et cetera, et cetera. And as he's reliving this memory, he's realizing like he doesn't want to be memorialized that way because this whole conflict is pointless. It means nothing, right? And in a fit of sort of rage, he rips off his name tag. He takes his dog tags and he throws them. He throws his helmet away, and he's basically saying that he wants to be a mystery, right? He wants, when they find his body, they don't know who he is. He doesn't want to be taken home as a hero and lauded and all that. And while this is occurring, a German soldier comes out in the trench, or comes out into the shell hole where he's laying, and is telling him to be quiet, like shushing him, but in a kind way.
He's almost giving him last rites in
Right.
some respect.
Yeah, and so you can tell he's trying to comfort him and tell him to be quiet and to sort of calm him down. And then the big part that kind of got me, and the reason that this story stuck with me so much, is that all I could think of is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Like the irony, the twisted irony of the fact that this guy, in his fit of, in his last dying moments and anguish, he wants to be forgotten because he doesn't want to be memorialized, to basically so other young boys will see him and emulate that, right? And ironically enough, I kind of assume that he does become that, right? Because you could assume that he is this sort of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. He does become this sort of memorial. But then at the end of this little story, the German soldier stands up and takes out his pistol, and he points it at him, and the private that's laying there is saying, "Just do it quickly," and then he kills him, right? But that's why it stuck with me, because the whole time I'm reading it, I'm thinking of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and like this sick irony of, in his last moments, this is what he wanted, and he got the exact opposite of that.
Right. And well, and I don't think March is trying to insinuate that this guy becomes the unknown soldier just because he kind of dies in German lines. I doubt they were able to recover his body, but it's very much he's coming to terms with the fact that everything he was brought up to believe is a lie. And I think that's the point of this book. And and I compare it to All Quiet on the Western Front, because at the beginning you have Remark. He writes that this is not, I'm not blaming anybody, this isn't anybody's fault so much, but this is just a record of what was happening.
Right. Well, I know there is commentary from March that I came across in my research, where he said that the reason he chose to write it in the style that he did, which is very unique, right, is because he wanted this to be a war novel about all soldiers in any conflict ever, essentially, right?
Right.
And he even makes a comment that the only reason it's from the American perspective is because that's the only perspective that he has.
Right.
So I think you're right about that. I think, like you said, he's not trying to say. I don't think he was making the connection to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That was just for me
Right,
reading it.
right.
That was the first thing that I drew on. But it does cover sort of, if there is a theme of the entire novel, it's the pointlessness and the futility of this conflict, or and maybe all conflicts from his perspective.
And at the same time, it's not this sort of peace on earth. Can't we all just get along? Uh, it's very earned, and it comes from a voice of experience. I think that's the difference here. I did find it amusing because this book not only talks about the horrors of war, but also talks about a lot about the soldiers' downtime.
Hmm.
Right? There's the men try and sneak off to the brothels to be entertained. I'll try to keep it PG. To be entertained by the French prostitutes, and they're often kicked out because there are only officers' brothels here, and if you want to, they're not allowed in, and they're told they kind of have this moment where they're like, well, I wonder what the girls are like in there. I bet they have to wear silk, and they have to do all these things, whereas the ones that they have access to, let's say, are less refined, right?
Yeah,
And
and
it
I was going to ask you, because you were in the military as well, right? Uh, The combat aspect of this book is not as easily relatable, just because none of us have experienced. You could make an argument that 1917 is like the most bloody war in the history of mankind, right?
Mhm.
Maybe 1943 competes, but regardless, I think the downtime stories and the stories of returning home were the most relatable for myself, because all of the like, I made notes constantly of like nothing ever changes, right? Because like you were like, whether it's the like one of the stories that stuck out with me was when I think it was Private Woldsworth loses his virginity to one of these women. If you remember that story,
Yes, yes.
and they basically trick him, and I felt bad for him because I knew guys even when I was in that were very moral, right, and had never
Yep, trying
done
to be
anything like
upstanding.
that. Yeah, and then by other Marines took it upon themselves to try to corrupt him as much as possible. And I found that like I've seen that before, you know?
Yep. To my ever enduring shame, I think I was one of those guys.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, same,
and
same.
I've kind of, you know, I it's weird I talk about books here, but most of the time I end up talking about my faith. I found God, and yeah, that's one of the things that in my I don't regret much in my life, but those sorts of things I do hold on to as um that that's a big knock on my character. So
No, and
so that
I
March
think
is able to put that out there, especially at the time when you have um, you know, still pretty Christian society. You know, church attendance is still pretty high. Uh, the media is not super sophisticated, and there's a lot of censorship and blasphemy laws still on the books, so you can't really get a real perspective on a lot of things. So this book, I mean, and you said you did a little research on this as well, but this book was shocking at the time because the people back home just had no idea what soldiers were like. Soldiering was not it's not what it is today. You know, where it's a legitimate career path. Even officers, but certainly enlisted soldiering was something for kind of drunks even and vagrants who had nothing else going on for them.
yeah, I think that's also an element of, and this is something that I actually talked with Burden about when we discussed the glass bees, is Junger makes this point of he witnesses the change from like a professional organized military to this army of masked individuals, right? And
Hmm.
so I think there was some element left. before this war occurred, where there was still this facade of like the professional, upstanding soldier, and then this war comes, and you're throwing average, everyday guys. Some of them, like you said, some of them are criminals, some of them are just farm boys, but you're just throwing them into it. And then not only are you throwing them into it, you're throwing them into some of the most horrendous combat imaginable, right? And so for them to come back and try to explain that to such a, like you said, like it's a society where the Hays Code still exists, right? And you can't say certain things and do certain things. So I guess my point is that that new type of warfare, that was new, basically, is what I guess what I'm getting at. And I think that was a struggle for people to understand, maybe.
There's and March kind of alludes to this as well. There's a point early in the book, the the men are kind of happy because they're under French command, so they're getting French rations, and that comes with a little bit of wine and some cognac. But that has to go away because the officers don't want to hear from the Women's Temperance League that their young men are being corrupted with alcohol.
Oh, I forgot about that one. Yeah, that
Yeah.
is. Yeah, that's
So you have
uh,
these, it's perfectly fine for these young men to be maimed and tortured and killed, but God forbid that they do it a little sauced.
right. Yeah, that's a good point, because that you do see that contrast. I forgot about that, because this would have been, right before Prohibition kicks off. And I guess the French are also, like, from an American perspective, especially at this point in time, much more loose with their morality.
Oh,
So
definitely. And I think especially the the French prostitutes part of the book, that was very risky, and for March to put in. And but at the same time, there's a reason that this book was so popular uh, at the time, and it's a real shame that it's since fallen out of print. And yeah, it just, I didn't know about it for the longest time until I just happened upon it, more or less. So the war ends, and the men who can return home do return home. But even there's no peace for them.
yeah, yeah, and I
Right.
think this is another point where I think March's book stands out amongst some other literature of the same time period, especially written about the First World War, is that you really see the how the war sort of impacts each individual person differently. And for some of these men, right, you see that they just move on with their lives. They get jobs, they get married or whatever. But you also get to see, for some of these men, they can never shake the events that basically shape them for the rest of their life.
There's one little vignette that I think probably hit me harder than all the others. Towards the end of the book, it's Private Walter Webster,
Oh,
and the gist of it is, and we talked about this a little bit in our DMs, but the gist of it is he was betrothed to this woman, Effie, right? And there was a lot of romance around the beginning of the war. She basically promised to marry him if he enlisted, and they would get married when he returned. And he does return, but he's badly mutilated. He's burned. His face is almost unrecognizable. Right? He doesn't look human, and he's he's stubborn and he's bitter that she wants to call the wedding off, right? But he's also it's not so much bitterness, but also just this I hate to use the word pathetic, but he's holding on to this idea, like, because it's clear that he very much loves this woman and needs to marry her to make everything that he's been through kind of worth it. And they go through with it. He doesn't let her out of the promise, she can't bear to look at him. She can't bear to touch him or be touched by him. And it ends on this somber note of, what have I done? I should just be dead.
Yeah, yeah, that one hit me hard, especially, because it ends that last ending paragraph where he lays his head in her lap, and he describes it, if I remember correctly. He says something about he could tell her repulsion by like the rigidity of the muscles in her legs, right? So he like lays his head on her lap, and she's so repulsed by him she can't even relax. And
And,
then he makes that comment about all he wanted her to do was tell him it's going to be okay or
and
something, and
and all she says in return, like all she can say is, "If you touch me, I'll vomit," she said. And that's the end. That's the end of the story right there.
yeah. And I think that story hits you hard, and that ending part really kind of, if somebody's going into this book and they were wanting to know what it's like, I'd say you're going to get hit like that in the gut a lot.
Every time. Yep.
You know,
Whether it's, that lieutenant who's sending the men out, and then he's like, I didn't know this, like I couldn't have known. Or whether it's, the men killing the prisoners.
right? And to get back to that story, because I do think that one's important, because in my research, what I had found was like that was actually the first thing that March wrote that would become this book itself,
Mm,
right? Is he I think he actually wrote it as like, if I remember correctly, sort of like a serial.
mhm.
And I don't know if he submitted to somebody or what, but somebody kind of had told him like, "Ah, this is too much," right? And then he decides to, do the whole book that way. But that story, I think, speaking of how this would have been difficult for Americans to digest, that narrative, which is, I think, goes across like 4 or 5 different soldiers' perspectives, um, is would have been difficult for Americans to understand that, like, yeah, these guys just murdered these German prisoners because they just wanted to. Really, the lieutenant wanted to. He didn't want to carry them around, and they kind of make excuses for why they do it, right? But I think that would have been really hard to digest, to realize like, hey, these soldiers aren't the shining beacon of hope you thought they were.
So to go back to the first chapter with Private Delaney, right? I found the part that I wanted to bring up, where he's talking to his wife, and this is the stand-in for March, and so you get this right away in the book, right? Um, we'd been silent for a time, and then my wife spoke. I'd take out the part about shooting prisoners. Why? I asked. Because it's cruel and unjust to shoot defenseless men in cold blood. It may have been done a few times, I'm not denying that, but it isn't typical. It couldn't have happened often. Would a description of an air raid be better? I asked. Would that be more humane? Would that be more typical? Yes, she said. Yes, that happened many times, I understand. Is it crueler, then, for Captain Matlock to order prisoners shot because he was merely stupid and thought the circumstances warranted that, than for an aviator to bomb a town and kill harmless people who are not even fighting him? That isn't as revolting as shooting prisoners, said my wife stubbornly. Then she added, You see, the aviator can't see where his bomb strikes or what it does, so he's not really responsible. But the men in your story had the prisoners actually before them. It's not the same thing at all. So you have this kind of twisted logic, but it also makes sense in a way.
Yeah.
For especially for people who haven't been there, they don't want stories. They don't want reality.
Hmm.
That it reminds me of that Stalin quote. One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic, sort of thing. Like the further away you can get from the reality on the ground, the easier it is to digest and to understand. Which is also one of the reasons I think drone warfare is so kind of pernicious and awful.
Yeah, or because it takes the responsibility off of all the parties involved, right? Except for the people getting bombed, right? And
Right.
it becomes easier and it becomes more sanitized. And in some ways, this is echoed too in another one of these stories in the book where I forget which private it is, but he's talking. He's basically a sniper or sharpshooter, and
That's right. Yes.
right, and I think he kills 9 out of 12 Germans like with one shot, and he's kind of bragging about it. And then he has this moment where he steps back and he says, if they were something about, basically if there was a race of little people no bigger than your thumb, even the nicest person in the world would have no problem basically stepping on them, right?
Right. Right. And then they talk about Jonathan Swift and uh, Gulliver's Travels. Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point too. It's like the sniper is.
Well, yeah, you see that you see even with the soldier that proclivity to try to excuse what he's doing by turning his target to not being human, right?
Right. Right. He needs to dehumanize them. And he gets commended. I think I think the only mention of like a general officer in the book is that a general comes to see him work in
Yeah.
sort of macabre terms, uh, and I think he gets a medal even for the 9 out of 12 that he gets.
Well, you know
Meanwhile,
how you said you know how you said that was it Private Delaney is a stand-in for March.
mhm,
I had read, in my research, I found a few because this book is not talked about a lot. If you Google it, you won't find much. But I did find some people who had suggested that there's another stand-in for March again, where if you remember towards the end when when the runner comes across the German soldier in the forest,
right,
and they kind of stop and look at each other because the German soldier's sitting there eating. I think he's eating some bread, and he's unaware of the American watching him. And then when he realizes it, they kind of have a stare off, and then they both go for their guns. And in the ensuing, scuffle, basically the American ends up, he gets him on his back and he drives his bayonet through the
yeah,
bottom of his,
yeah,
and he can't get the bayonet out. And then he has this reoccurring nightmare where that German soldier is just sitting there in his room all night watching him after he's gotten home from the war.
right,
And then he ends up having like a conversation with the ghost of this German. Anyways, there's people saying that they thought that was also sort of a stand-in for March as well, because of sort of how his life played out later on when because he dies in New Orleans like alone. And so I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I could see why, because I almost think that the stories where you get where there's a longer narrative and more personal, I almost think that is more of March putting himself in there.
right. You can tell which stories are sort of the backbone and which are kind of not filler, because I think there's value in every one of these vignettes, and I don't think you could really take anything out without diminishing the book. But there's definitely like, oh, I need to put this in here so that it makes more narrative sense
Yeah.
here and there. And then there are, yeah, like you said, these longer experiences that make up the bulk of the novel. There's also you kind of see at the end. Uh, there's one soldier who we met at the beginning. I think his name is Rowland something. Uh, who we met at the beginning, and he's one of the guys who's like, "Oh, I could have, or I could take on the whole army, right?" And meanwhile, at the end of the war, he's yelling at the radio because of something. Because he's bitter that he's lost use of his legs and his sister has to take care of him.
Mm. Oh, that
So
was him.
Rowland something.
Yeah. No. Yeah. It's sometimes like when you're reading it, you kind of have to really take note of names to kind of connect that some of these stories are continuations, because I would forget that all the time.
Oh, you know what? It
Because
actually, sorry, Rowland. He dies in the bombardment. It's Leslie Yaffwitz or
mm,
Yaffitz. That's another thing too. Is that I bet some of these names have to be real
oh
because
yeah,
you know uh, speaking from some experience, it's hard for me to imagine names that aren't just like Mike Jones,
Yeah, yeah.
or Tom Miller, like really basic stuff. There's some, there's some real creativity trying to differentiate these men.
I
If
would
there,
I would would you get I would guess that he probably, and I don't know if it's true, that he mixed the names up. Like he took one last name and one first name.
I'm guessing, yeah, or
Yeah.
maybe even like just taking stuff from like newspaper death
Hmm.
tolls, or death rolls rather. Uh, I think that that's very possible because the one criticism I will levy at the book is a lot of the soldiers just kind of sound the same.
Hmm.
They and that could also just be because there's not a lot of time to flesh out characters. Uh, he, some of them get less than a page to flesh things out, but there is you know, it does kind of meld together, and maybe that's like you said at the beginning, it's kind of on purpose. It's supposed to be a stand-in for any soldier in any conflict. So it could be, that could have been on purpose. Are there any other vignettes that kind of stand out to you, John, that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean it's funny because like when I started taking notes, like okay, I'm gonna write down the ones I like. I ended up with like 15 or 20. So
Yeah,
I had
yeah.
to, because there's so many of them that you realize. But if I was gonna go, because there's some at the end, but I think you know from the beginning. Let's see. We already talked about. Oh, there's one that I want to get your thoughts on this, especially as somebody else who's also a religious man. Do you remember the story of Private Geller and they eat the bread, the blood soaked bread?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
Like that story was hard, like not hard to read, but it was disturbing because essentially what happens is two soldiers come upon a dead German and he's laid across a log on his I think he's laying on his back, right?
Right.
And he's sort of prostrate, which I think there's some symbolism there I want to get to, but he's laid out on his back. They turn him over, they go through his knapsack, and they find a loaf of bread. And the problem is because he's been shot in the front, the blood has drained backwards and it's gone into his pack, and the bread is soaked with blood, right? And at first they're not going to eat it, right? And he goes to throw it away, and the other soldier that's with Private Geller, says, "What are you doing? You're going to waste that bread?" And they sit down and they eat this blood-soaked bread.
Yeah.
And while I was reading it, because I reread it before, the other day, and I kept thinking, I don't know if this is intentional by March or not, but the way that he's described to be laying down on his back across a piece of wood is sort of reminiscent of the crucifixion, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then you have sort of this twisted Eucharistic ceremony going on with eating the blood soaked bread.
It's kind of, yeah. It's like a reverse communion. Like
Right.
they've really they lose something in their humanity there. If communion is sort of, if Holy Communion is literal communion with the divine, then this is the opposite of that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that is, I would imagine it has to be intentional in some capacity. I don't think that that would have been lost on him. But like reading through the second time, I think you make a good point. It's sort of a reverse communion where they're partaking in a level of savagery that maybe, like you said, takes away their humanity. It makes them closer to being animals, because a civilized person shouldn't eat blood-soaked bread regardless of how
Right.
hungry they are.
And they're in they're in, savage animal conditions. You
Hmm.
know, I doubt they're eating much. They might be eating, somewhat well, but even and Remark kind of talks about this in All Quiet on the Western Front. They get the soldiers get the best rations in Germany. Germany's basically starving at this point, but they don't always eat because the cook might be too afraid to get to the lines.
Mm.
So they scrounge for what they can. And I have to imagine that it's on both sides of no man's land that is occurring. Otherwise, yeah, it would be easy to just throw away some blood soaked bread. Uh,
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think that's probably where the key lies. Like they've reached a point where basically that's it. They've lost their humanity, right? They've gotten just close enough to tasting sort of I guess you'd call it evil or more of a animalistic nature that it's almost like a temptation where he's going to throw the bread away. He could throw the bread away. He could deal with being hungry, but his friend sort of playing the other role tells him like, "What are you doing? Are you stupid?"
yeah,
And that sort of overrides his more rational faculty, I guess.
yeah. There's a and March dances with this being like a great literary work with stuff like that, and I wish that he did more of that in the book, but at the same time he's trying to be like a sober, honest reporter of what happened, uh, more so than trying to write, let's say, the Moby Dick of war books, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think he, like you said, like there's you can see the talent that March has, and his ability to sort of to draw out these important moments or these occurrences that maybe aren't tangible or wouldn't be noticed the average person, but because of what he's trying to do with this book, like we talked about before, like trying to make it almost a universal text for warfare or this experience of the soldier on the front line, you you don't get a chance to see him flesh that out at all.
Definitely. And you know this book, I can't stress how short this book is for everything that happens in it, and you almost wish that it were longer, but at the same time, it's everything that happens in it is so horrific that you just want it over as quickly as possible, right? So the soldiers, they don't want they don't want this to go on any longer than it has to, and they just want it to be they want it to be a forgotten bad dream, like forgotten memory. And I think the length of the book, is intentional in that way.
Yeah, and I think it probably mirrors in some way the length of the war itself or the abrupt end of the war itself for the Americans, right? Because they're only there for like a year,
Hmm.
and they experience a lot in that year, but it's very fast paced. It happens and it's over, and that's sort of how the book feels. It feels to me, at least personally, I don't know how you feel about this. It felt longer while reading it than it did in between reads, right? So I'd read 50 pages pretty quickly, but while reading it, it felt longer because of he's always twisting that knife, you
Right.
know.
But yeah, he's like, it's almost like being waterboarded when you're reading this. Like
Hmm.
it's kind of torturous to read, but he never lets up, because that would be a disservice to what happened.
Yeah, I mean, he has like what a handful of stories you'd say that are almost like I wouldn't call them comedic relief, but that feel that way. Like one of my favorite ones just thought was funny was when the one private meets the Queen of England.
Right, right.
You get a few of those, right, where he's, because the private is wounded, and she goes to see the wounded soldiers, and he's like delusional out of it on morphine or whatever, and he thinks it's some lady from his hometown, some older lady. And the
Right.
next later on, when he comes to, they tell him, "Oh, it was the Queen," and he basically says, "Well, apologize to her, but Miss So and So is a nice lady." Um, yeah, but you get a few of these little kind of funny, like snippets, but they're very few and far between, and most of them, fortunately or unfortunately, are related to the prostitutes, right? Because that's the
Yeah.
only downtime they get.
There's this one at the end, right? Guy's walking down the street, and he sees, a girl that he knew before the war, and he's talking about how, oh, it's nice to see you. Yeah, I'm married right now, and my wife and I, we have a life together. We're gonna have kids. I'm glad to see that you're all right. It's so nice to see you. And you realize, oh, she was a prostitute that he married before he left. And he's trying to get past all of this, and she has her own mini crisis while he was away, because obviously life doesn't work out for her, right? And she gets him arrested for bigamy.
Yeah. Well, and you remember too, it's even worse than that because I don't know if she tricked him or not, but remember he marries her before he leaves, and then he
Yeah,
sends her all
exactly.
his
Yeah,
money.
yeah.
Yeah, so when he comes home, at first he comes to look for her, and the landlady where she was living is like, "Oh no, she's been gone, and also she spent all your money." And so then he has this sort of like, "All right, this
Yeah,
sucks, whatever." And then
whatever.
he meets this new girl, and he even kind of describes her as like not being as attractive, but
Right.
she's nice and she's sweet and all this stuff. So
And she's
he
not a
ends up,
prostitute. Yeah.
and she's not a prostitute, and he marries her, and they have 3 kids, and then like you said, he meets this prostitute. He tells her all this. She plays him for a fool and gets him thrown in jail for bigamy because he's still technically legally married to
Yeah,
her, right?
yeah. And it's just little tragedies. March does a great job of uh peppering in these small everyday sort of tragedies on top of the big, you know, like things that really stick with you. And it's like, oh
Yeah.
man, like, oh, that's kind of annoying, or that, oh, that sucks. But, in the context of everything that this guy's been through, it's like, oh, really? Like now this also on top of it, like it's just,
Well, I think that's where you see like that. That's where I think, in my opinion, that's how you can really tell that this is a guy who's been there before because he's putting these things in there that you almost feel like you couldn't have made that up unless you had been at least tangentially related to these events in some
right.
capacity. Because if you took somebody who's never been in the military, never been in a warfare or whatever, and you had them write a war book or a novel, they're going to have a hard time adding in all these little things that seem completely unconnected to actual war itself.
Yeah, it's like, oh, why are you telling me this? You know,
Yeah. Um,
but yeah, like even so, and I'm gonna keep, you and I should do an episode on All Quiet on the Western Front. It's like one of my favorite books. Uh, I don't know if you've read it.
no, yeah, I would be down for that because and this is something we can talk about offline. But I really think there's something about if you were to take Storm of Steel, All Quiet on the Western Front, and Company K, you can kind of synthesize like the full range of what it's like to be in like real warfare.
Right, right. But I bring up All Quiet on the Western Front again because at the beginning these guys are so happy to get a full meal, and you're like, why are these guys like, oh, they're just eating whatever, and then you realize the reason that they have all these rations is because they're only 80 of 150 men, that like, so 150 men went out, 80 came back, so they have double rations.
Hmm.
So it's like, yeah, these guys are celebrating, but they just lost literally half of their company.
Yeah, well, that do you remember the story in there where he kills the fawn?
No, you're gonna have to
Okay,
remind
so
me.
so towards the end of the book, there's this weird story because I say weird because like the being a fawn there is kind of strange, but whatever. They're
Hmm.
getting ready to leave. The war's over, and there's this old French lady and a little girl, and they're like camped outside their house. And at the beginning of the story, this one private has this basically almost gets in a fist fight with the cook because the food is so crappy, right?
Mm.
They have words. They kind of it stops before it gets violent. He goes and sits down. He's eating, and there's this little with the old the old French lady is yelling in French, or not yelling. She's praising them in French. Oh, thank you for liberating us. The war's over. The Germans are gone. And while this is going on, there's this behind the fence. There's this fawn running around, and the private whistles. And when he does, the fawn like perks up and starts dancing in circles and gets all excited. And they're like, do it again. And because the fawn won't respond to anybody else but him, and so every time he whistles, the fawn gets excited. And they're getting ready to leave, and he asked the old lady, if he can have the fawn, and she says, no, no, you can't do that. And then she changes her mind at the end because she's like, well, you've done all this stuff for us and the fawn loves you, right? Because it gets out of the fence and just sticks beside him. So he takes it and he's like, all right. And the whole time they're marching back, the fawn is just enamored with him and lets him pet him. It's following him around. And they get to this French town, however far later on in the story. And he goes privately to the cook when the cook is sitting by himself, and he says, hey, just between you and me, would you cook up some nice venison steaks? And the cook looks at him. He's like, no, you can't do that. That thing loves you. Like, that's wrong. And he was like, it'll just be between you and me. And then the cook kind of looks, kind of like gets quiet for a moment. And then he says, well, I think it'd be better if it was in a stew with like potatoes and onions. And he goes, okay, but just between us. And then he goes, hey, and he says, hand me the bread knife. And then it ends.
Yeah,
that was
there's not a lot that gets to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think, the harm of animals and small children,
yeah,
is something that really just turns my stomach.
Yeah, that was a weird story, and you're right. It's sort of the sacrifice of innocence that even after this war's over, it almost to me felt like March's commentary on like they're still carrying with them this propensity for violence, I guess.
Yeah, they're forever changed, and in this guy's case, he's just tainted.
Mm-hmm.
And now, and I didn't think about it in these terms until we got into it. But yes, this is a very Christian book, but not in the way that like Dostoevsky is, or like C.S. Lewis is. It's almost like the inverse. Like, this is what happens to men without God.
Yeah, and
This is the extreme fallen nature.
right. And you can only imagine, like, look, I think you brought up a good point earlier about because of the time frame it's written in, you could almost argue that it's muted, right? Because of things like the Hays Code or just the social, the social environment of the time. So you can only imagine, like, you using the point you just made, like if March was alive now and was had the freedom to say whatever he wanted, I think you'd see that point even more, because he would be able to give you more of a glimpse, which is saying a lot because he gives you a glimpse sort of behind the curtain of how horrible war really is. As when we haven't even touched on the fact that there was a murder, right? Like one of the privates murders his lieutenant.
Yeah.
And then there's I think I would call it a murder,
Like
but it's all
the earliest instance of fragging that I've ever heard of.
yeah, and it's just a blatant. It's not even a heat of the moment murder, right? It's almost.
Oh, he's
I mean, I guess.
premeditated. Like I think because he's been planning it for so long. And it's something stupid too. Like, it's over. I think he made him. I forget what he did, but it was something like that all soldiers have to do at some point.
It was like fire watch type deal. Like,
Yeah,
hey, you're on watch, and he just didn't want to get up, and he was pissed off.
yeah.
Yeah, because he stalks the lieutenant, and then like jumps down and stabs him with the bayonet, and then he runs back to his bunk so that nobody catches him. And you never really get there's no closure to that story because it just ends. Like, you don't know what happens. Because even at the end, when there is a section where March is sort of reading off the court martials that happen, right, in one of the stories, and you get some of the deserters, and there's some of these kids, like as it's described, they're not really deserters, right? Like, one of them goes, I think, and visits a prostitute, and he tries to catch up to the company, and by the time he catches up to them, they think he's deserted, and they throw him in. He gets court-martialed. I think he's like 15 years. But you never hear anything about, during that sequence, you never hear anything about the murder that occurred. So I can only assume he got away with it.
There's one story towards the end. Private Everett Qualls. He's a cattle farmer, and it just says that the calf gets sick, right, or the cow gets sick, right, and this is post-war. He's living on his homestead with his wife and children, but the farm is failing, and that just becomes too much for him. And at the end of the story, he kills himself. He locks himself in a room. He puts the barrel of the gun in his mouth. His wife is like pounding on the door trying to get to him, but he won't let her in. And he kills himself and just has this image of buffalo running across the country.
Do you
And
remember? Do you remember why he felt like he was cursed?
let's see. He said, yeah, because I have got it open right now, and let me try and see.
Because I didn't put these two together till yesterday when I was going through my notes.
No, okay, so just tell me because I can't find it right now.
Okay, yeah. So when I was going through my notes, I realized like he's the private that steals the medals from the French family.
Oh,
So remember, they go there. This French family is really nice to them. They invite the soldiers in. They feed them. They take care of them. And their son was killed early in the war, and they were given like this big fancy medal. I don't remember what it is, but some type of like plaque or whatever that commemorates their son, them giving up their son essentially for France. And when the company moves on and they leave these people, they get down the road later, and one of the other soldiers realizes that the Private Qualls has stolen that from them.
right.
And it's sort of like, and the soldier that's telling the story is like, he says something like he didn't know men could be so cruel, right? Like for him, that was his sort of like crossing the Rubicon moment of realizing how horrible people can be. But then I realized later reading through it that, oh, that's like you said, he's a farmer and he's accounting like first it's the calf and the crops or whatever, and then his kid dies, right? One of his kids dies, he gets sick and dies. And then
Right.
that's right, and that's when he ends up killing himself. And I was like, oh, that's the curse. He feels cursed because of what he did. And maybe he is or not, I don't know, but he's attributing, I think, all this to that.
Well, and I just found this one part towards the end. He's talking about how he was one of the guys who shot the prisoners.
Oh, okay.
He hears Sergeant. I could hear Sergeant Pelton giving the signal to fire, and I
Mm.
could see those prisoners falling and rising and falling again. Blood poured from their wounds, and they twisted on the ground as I was twisting now on the floor. And he's
Mm.
talking about, so yes, he's clearly he didn't leave it all behind. He didn't leave any of it behind, and yeah,
Yeah, it's
it's just
following him.
it's such a gut punch of a book. It's like going 10 rounds with Mike Tyson, you know.
Yeah, I agree because I would go, and he does a good job, I would say, of for the most part breaking up the really harder stories.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I would go like 5 or 6 stories, and then I would literally just lay the book down. I was like, I
Yep.
need a minute. I
I
got.
read I read it in a day, but it was a very long day. Uh, all right, John. So I think we've kind of beat this horse to death. Uh,
Was the
any any parting thoughts on the book, and then we'll get out of here.
Oh yeah, no, I would just say it's definitely worth your time. It's probably it's probably the best American war novel in my personal opinion. Um, and I think, like I said earlier, we could talk about some other time. It pairs really well with something that's not as anti-war because it at least gives you like a counterbalance to that. But it shouldn't be forgotten, and it's a book that I think anybody who's interested in the human experience or the extremes of war should read, basically.
I think that's yeah. We'll leave it there. So, John, where can people find you? What do you do? Tell the nice people how they can support you out there in the world.
Yeah, you can. I write on Substack some of some of it's some of the fiction I'm working on. Some of it's just my incoherent thoughts on what's going on in the world. It's completely free. You can subscribe there, check it out. I'm currently posting chapter by chapter of a a noir novel I'm writing about. The first chapter's up on there, and then outside of that, I just talk smack on Twitter. So you can follow me at T Propensity at I guess it's X Duck. I don't know what it is now.
Yeah, it
You
used
could
to be
probably you'll
Twitter.
have to
Now it's X.
yeah you'll have to link it because I don't even remember. I'm the worst at shilling my
Yeah,
stuff.
I haven't been doing that, but yeah, I should in the notes I will add people's links and I will add your links. And if you've made it this far, I want to thank you for listening to Canon Fodder. If you'd like to support Canon Fodder and the Double Dealer, we now accept sort of patron donations through Substack. Whatever amount that you'd like to donate per month is very appreciated. You can also buy our magazine that we put out quarterly. Issue 11 will be coming out the end of December. And all the money that we raise goes to writers and artists who contribute to the magazine. So you are funding art that is not fake and gay, like so much else that is out in the world. So for the Double Dealer, this is TR Hudson, joined by John Slaughter, and goodbye.